I think there are a certain class of problems that capitalism is the wrong tool to use that rely on altruism. That said, there is a tremendous amount of good that this economic engine can be directed at. I mean, across the board, startups are this tremendous engine of innovation. The areas where I think that they can't add that much are very narrow. There's few of them. Almost everything else, I think that innovative energy is hugely beneficial. There's very few problems that startups are not actively contributing to solving.
皆さんこんにちは。ビジネスサクセスジャパンのポッドキャストへようこそ。Hello everyone and welcome to the Business Success Japan podcast. This is your host, Liddy Buchelman. This podcast is made for those who want to develop or strengthen the communication skills, cultural savvy, insights into current trends and conditions, and mindsets that are essential in a Japanese business environment. The helpful, practical suggestions and engaging insights offered here provide listeners with the in-depth cultural context needed to achieve their own version of success while collaborating with Japanese counterparts. Today, I have the privilege of sharing a conversation that I had with Tim Romero. Tim is a Tokyo-based entrepreneur, author, and innovator with a diverse background in startups and technology. He is deeply engaged in Japan's startup ecosystem as a partner at JERA Ventures with a focus on sustainability and decarbonization. Previously, he led initiatives at Google for Startups Japan and has founded several companies throughout his career. Tim also hosts the podcast Disrupting Japan, where he explores the unique stories of Japanese entrepreneurs. His journey reflects resilience and a commitment to fostering innovation in Japan's vibrant startup community. Be sure to keep listening to learn more about Tim and his insights into the Japanese startup ecosystem.
I'm Tim Romero. I'm a partner at JERA Ventures, a serial entrepreneur here. I run a podcast called Disrupting Japan, where I focus on startup founders and what it's like to be an innovator in a culture that prizes conformity.
Yeah, and it's actually a podcast that I was listening to probably around when I started my podcast or even earlier. So I've been able to enjoy it
Thank you.
for a very long time. And I definitely recommend it to anybody who's interested in startups or even just entrepreneurship in Japan. So would you mind just telling us how you ended up in Japan in the first place?
Wow, that's a long story. But to make it really short, I actually first moved to Japan when a Japanese record company brought me here. I used to be a professional musician. My music career was short, even by Japanese standards. Was here for about 3 years, had a lot of fun. I mean, played a lot of places, made a lot of friends, moved to LA, did the music thing there for 3 years or so. Ended up done with music. Ended up working at a trading company doing IT stuff. They transferred me back to Japan. And this, in the late 90s, this internet thing sounded kind of interesting to me. So I quit that job, started my first startup, sold that, did that a few more times. Yeah, so that's how I wound up in Japan. I was never planning to stay here. I've been here around 30 years now. I never planned to stay here quite that long.
So given that Japan has such a reputation for being a little bit more risk averse, maybe that seems a little bit less attractive to people hoping to start a company. Why did you decide to keep going in Japan instead of going back to like the classic Silicon Valley?
Yeah, it wasn't until 2015 or so that I ever actually decided to stay in Japan per se. There was always a new project starting up or a new company or a new opportunity. And so I was excited about that opportunity and it just happened to be in Japan. So I stayed. And 2015 was the first time that I consciously made a decision. The startup I was helping to run the market entry for, they were closing down overseas offices. They offered me a job back in San Francisco. And I don't know, I just decided that was at that point, the next 10 years looked a lot more interesting in Japan than they did in San Francisco. So I decided to stay. But for the most part, it's just been interesting projects and one thing leads to another rather than any kind of grand plan.
Yeah, I feel like even when people do have a grand plan, things end up getting sidetracked anyway, but it's a lot more fun that way, I think. So would you mind breaking down a little bit more what you do now for people who may not be so familiar with the terminology?
Absolutely. So I'm a partner at JERA Ventures, and JERA is, most people outside the energy industry have never heard of JERA, but we generate about a third of Japan's electric power. And JERA Ventures is their venture capital arm that invests in decarbonization technology, green energy fuels, new clean forms of energy generation, as well as things to help our customers decarbonize and to digitize the whole energy supply chain. So, it's an exciting chance to actually take some carbon off the grid and out of the atmosphere. And we invest in startups globally that support that mission.
Great. So, what makes venture capital different from what people might typically imagine when they think about funding a business or finding funding for a business?
I think the thing that most people are surprised at when they come in it from outside is that it's much more relationships and judgments about people than it is about spreadsheets and mathematical modeling. Although the mathematical models have their place, in the end you're usually trying to evaluate the founding teams, their relationship with their customers. So I think a lot of people underappreciate the time it takes to build a reputation and build a book of business in venture capital and the kind of work it really is.
And it's something that I've been lucky enough to learn a little bit more about. So I recommend people do a little bit of homework if it's something that sounds interesting to them too. But today I kind of just wanted to break down a little bit more about what startups are and what makes them different from how people might usually think about entrepreneurship.
So I think, the best explanation I've ever heard that about what a startup is, how it's different from a regular business, was from Steve Blank, who's a Stanford professor. And I'm gonna mangle the quote, but I'll get the spirit of it right. He was saying a startup is a temporary organization designed to find a workable business model. So the idea is that a startup is disposable. They're out there trying to make something work, to invent something, to build a business model, to build a sustainable business. Whereas an enterprise company exists to optimize a proven business model. They exist to take something, a basic system they know works, and to make it more effective and make it more scalable. And so I think the startups, what separates like a startup from a small business, like opening a restaurant, is not really, in most cases it's not a startup. You're doing something, you know what the business model is, you know how restaurants work. It doesn't make it easy. I mean, it's hard. But what defines a startup is they're trying to do a new kind of business.
And so, because of that, it's a little bit harder to get funding from more traditional sources like a bank because there's a lot more learning involved, there's a lot more uncertainty.
Well, there's a lot more learning involved. And again, it's an unknown business model. So banks like to loan money on things they know. So if you've been in business for 5 years and you do all of your sales in December, banks are really happy to loan you money in June, right? Because it's predictable. They know you'll have the money in December, you'll pay them back. But when you've never earned any money yet and you're not sure you've got a business model that's going to work at all, well, banks understandably don't want to loan money. It's not their business. So that's where venture capital fits in. So venture capital actually buys a percentage of the business that they sort of co-own with the founding team. And when the startups manage to find that new business model, when they manage to create something new, everybody profits.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm not sure if this is the right way to phrase this question, but what makes somebody a more effective venture capitalist versus somebody who might be a little bit prone to trying to push startups into a direction that may not be best for them?
Well, wow, that's a really really good question. I don't think I have a single answer to that. I think there are really good VCs. So there are things I can say like good VCs understand founders, they understand the founder journeys. But that said, I know plenty of VCs who've never run a company. They've been finance people their whole lives, and they're really good VCs. So I think there's a lot of skill sets people bring to the table.
Hmm. So it might just be a little bit more a matter of just finding the right fit. There isn't a like platonic form of the venture capitalist. You just kind of have to find the right person for you.
Finding the right niche, yeah. And even like some of the most cliched advice on good VCs have a deep understanding of the technology and the business they're investing in. I know one, I'm not going to say any names, he's a very well-known VC, doesn't understand technology, doesn't want to. He's almost proud in the fact that he doesn't, but he's been remarkably successful at picking winners. So it's people bring very different skill sets to it.
Yeah, and that diversity, probably what makes it so exciting. It makes it so resilient and allows so many different people to flourish. So, yeah, you don't want everybody to function and work the same way for sure. So, then is there anything that you would say makes the startup ecosystem in Japan unique?
I think there's a few very interesting things that are fairly unique about it. I'd say one is the degree to which startups and enterprise collaborate in Japan. It's much, much higher than you see in the United States or in Europe. And both in terms of the funding, the percentage of corporate dollars or yen invested in Japan is much higher than it is elsewhere. But also in startups, their go to market, they're partnering with large organizations as part of their growth strategy is much more common in Japan than it is in the US, where startups, perhaps just because they're better funded and bigger, but they tend to view the incumbents more as adversaries from the get go.
That's really interesting that it's so different here. Do you have any sense of why the big companies aren't seen as adversaries?
Well, I think a lot of it's not necessarily by choice. I think there's a couple things at play. So I think that long-term business relationships are easier to maintain in Japan than they are in the U.S. U.S. tends to be much more transactional in nature. Um, so there's a more stability in a partnership between a startup and an enterprise in Japan than in the U.S. or Europe. But the other thing, particularly in the consumer space, but across the board, brands are more important in Japan than they are in the US. So I think one of the myths about the Japanese market is that Japanese consumers are very conservative. They don't like to try new things. And that's not exactly right. So if Suntory introduced 6 different flavors of canned coffee for spring, great. That'd be really popular. People would want to try them all. I'm sure they'd all have a cute little character or something to go along with them. Those kind of things are very popular. Japanese consumers are novelty seeking. But if some unknown startup it tries to introduce a new kind of canned coffee, there's this doubt like, well, who are these people? Who are they? What are they doing? So it's not exactly a hesitance for novelty. It's just there's a lot of trust in brands in Japan. So, particularly on the consumer side, going to market with an established partner can make it a whole lot easier.
And kind of given that preference for having a strong brand, is it a little bit harder for companies starting out to source that social proof on their own?
It can be. I think it's easier in new markets. So, what we've seen on the internet with a lot of financial innovation, it's easier if a startup can kind of define their own little niche. But very quickly, well, actually, let's look at finance for example. So for a number of years, there were a lot of really interesting, creative wealth managements, insurance startups, all competing on the net. And eventually, the large companies, the large banks, started partnering and allying and to some extent acquiring these startups. And to hit real scale, those startups needed those big banks, those big brands to hit meaningful scale. Now, I suppose they could have spent the time to build their own brand, but that takes many years. And in the meantime, the major brands aren't standing still, right? They would just look for another partner. So yeah, brands have a lot of staying power in Japan. They mean a lot.
Yeah, I can definitely see that from just my own experience. But so then, in your experience just from both being an entrepreneur yourself and getting involved in the investing side of the startup ecosystem here, are there any specific qualities or practices that tend to kind of separate the successful from those that struggle or even fail?
Oh, on the founders side, yeah, I'd say all successful founders that I know are very much focused on solving a specific problem. They're very conscious of what the purpose of their startup is, and sometimes the problem is not some global earth shaking problem, but they know what value they're providing, and they're laser focused on delivering that. And after that, there's a lot of variation. Sometimes some of the most successful companies are founded by teams. Some are founded by solo founders. Some raise a lot of capital early. Some bootstrap and don't raise capital till late. But in terms of the founder, just that focus on the value the startup is providing is really critical. That's very indicative of how successful they'll be.
Yeah, I can see how if you don't have that clear vision, it could be really hard to, well, on one hand, even know what you want to provide the customer, but then also keep yourself motivated to actually achieve it. So then I guess another thing I would like to hear a little bit more about is even if they are able to maintain this very clear vision of the problem they want to solve, are there any roadblocks that tend to at least hinder people early on, things that if they had known about ahead of time, maybe they could have had a smoother start?
Oh, well, I mean, nothing works out as planned ever. But I'd say probably the three biggest challenges that all founders face. You spend almost all your time doing one of three things. You're either doing sales, you're getting customers, you're recruiting, you're building a team, and you're fundraising. And that's pretty much how you spend your life as a founder. You're doing one of those things.
Yeah. Would you mind talking a little bit more about fundraising specifically, since that's something that most people probably aren't very familiar with and wouldn't even know where to start?
Yeah, sure. I've done a lot of it I've been on both sides of that particular table. And in fact, not to plug the show too aggressively, but if you go to disruptingjapan.com, I've put together one page dedicated to raising funds in Japan. And there's a lot of really good links on there. But I'd say kind of carrying on with the thing I said earlier about being laser focused on the problem you're solving. I'd say if you want to be very successful fundraising, you need to understand that problem you're solving, and not simply like going in and say, okay, global warming is a big problem and we want to solve it. How are you doing that? What are the steps? Which customers have agreed to buy this software or buy this hardware? you know do you have that validation? Do you have a path to solving the problem you say you're solving? Are all the pieces moving in that direction? Show that you've got the right team behind you, or if you don't, show how you're going to recruit that team and explain how you're going to use the money. So, if you're a consumer company, say we've sold these 300 units during crowdfunding, we think we're going to use the money in this way to develop it. If you're an enterprise company, say we've done these pilots, and just lay out how the money will be used to solve that problem you clearly understand. Explain the team, and you'll be listened to.
Yeah, just be very clear on what you have to offer and what you're going to use the resources for. So then how do you go about building that team? I know that in Japan, a lot of people are a little bit more hesitant to take on new team members just because the labor laws are a little bit more strict here. So in the States, it's a little bit easier to get rid of people if they become redundant or if you start having financial difficulties, but it's a little bit more difficult in Japan.
Yeah, that's very much true. It's much harder to fire people, not only legally but socially. And honestly, as a startup, you're always losing money. The CEO is never taking much of a salary if you're doing things right. So it's actually legally, it's relatively easy to justify, or it's easier to justify headcount reductions as a startup than as an enterprise. But even if you can justify it legally, it's got a big social cost. It's very bad for morale to try to force people out. So yeah, you are much more careful about who you hire in Japan than you are in the US, certainly, or in other Asian countries that have looser employment laws. I don't know if there's a lot of chatter about that changing. I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. So I do think just Japanese startups are very careful about who they hire.
And do you feel like that might cause a little bit of a slowdown in growth early on, or does it really just kind of sort itself out eventually?
Well, no, it is a problem, not so much in the very early days, but in the scaling phase. So in the early days, let's say the first 10 to 15, let's say the first 15 people you hire, those people everyone's really careful about. They're people, they're people who believe in the vision, they're people who come on at probably a pretty low salary. Those people you tend to be pretty confident about. But when you try to grow from 15 to 50 or from 50 to 200, you're putting in new hiring processes, you might be changing the direction of your business, and suddenly you've got 20 people who you just have absolutely no work for. That's when it's really a problem, during the rapid scaling phase. So I think the labor laws don't hurt enterprises that much. It doesn't hurt the very, very early seed stage startups, but during that scaling phase, it can really slow things down. I think that's where startups feel it the most.
Yeah. So then you've alluded to a little bit of a lower salary for founders and even for people who come onto the company early on, just because obviously you want to focus on growing the business itself. But then what is the selling proposition for even founding a company or joining a company early on? What value does it give the people who do jump on?
Well, there's two. So one is just, it tends to be very rewarding work. Most early founders are attracted to the fact that you're working on an important problem. I mean, at least they think so. It's a problem they care about, or they wouldn't be going to the startup. So there's that. But there's also the chance of very good financial returns. So if you're an early employee or one of the founders, you'll have a a percentage of the company, and as that company grows, the VCs who put money in and buy some of those shares, and the founding team all profit, and sometimes quite handsomely if the startup grows, scales, and gets acquired, or does an IPO.
A little bit of a lower reward on the front end, but the possibility of a great reward on the back end. And you get to do what you care about, which has its own intrinsic value. So I got the chance to read a book by Richard Katz recently, who wrote a book about Japan's economic future.
I have that book. I had a coffee with Richard just a few days ago.
Oh, great. I got to see him on a talk a week or so ago, too. So, yeah, I was really happy that I finally got to actually see him in person and hear a little bit more about what he's doing. So, in his book, he talked a lot about how it can be a little bit harder for people to even recruit talent just because in Japan, if you lose your job, it can be a lot harder to kind of get back on the mainstream track, to rejoin a company, to go back and have a more traditional career. In your experience, has that been changing in recent years, or is that still a little bit of a factor?
It's still very real. I think so. Job mobility is an issue, and this goes back to being difficult to lay off staff, to let people go, is part of the job mobility issue. So yeah, enterprise companies don't tend to hire people mid-career. It's rare. It does happen, but it's rare. So for example, JERA, where I work, it's a newer company. It was spun out and created from two energy utilities. And so that was an unusual situation. It's a new company. So there are a lot of people that were brought in mid-career from outside, often outside the energy industry. But in general, companies still don't hire mid-career. Now, the exception there, I think, is if you have a defined skill and you are, let's say, 35 and under. I'm kind of ballparking the age, but if you are a programmer, if you're a designer, if you're an attorney, if you're a CPA, if you're someone with a defined skill, that labor market's getting more mobile. That is, companies are hiring, both startup new companies and enterprises are hiring in, particularly engineers, designers, things like that. But once you go the next level up, once you're kind of on the management track, that kind of starts to lock up. Now, a lot of people are leaving enterprise companies to join startups. That's happening more and more, and that's fantastic. But there's not much of a return trip. So in the United States, for example, there is this steady stream of people who go from large enterprises to work at startups and then back to the enterprise. And there's this wonderful kind of cross-pollination and idea sharing on both sides. And we don't have that yet in Japan. So far, it's mostly one way.
And it makes me laugh just because I remember my cousin even saying, "Oh, I don't think that I'll be getting a competitive salary at my current job, but I really like the benefits. So I'll leave for a few years and then come back so I get a better salary and then get a boost too." And that's a little bit more tricky. In Japan, it's not quite so easy to play the game that way, unfortunately. So then just thinking about people who may be looking at how big companies tend to function in their home country or globally, a lot of people might be a little bit suspicious that any business could really solve more problems than it causes, especially thinking about pollution, thinking about environmental impact and things like that. And what would you say to somebody who might be a little bit more suspicious of the idea that we can make the world a better place through businesses?
Well, I actually understand where they're coming from. And in some ways, I'm kind of skeptical of that as well. I think there are a certain class of problems that capitalism is the wrong tool to use. There are certain class of problems that rely on altruism. I mean, there's education, a lot of issues in education, a lot of how healthcare is delivered. So actually, I don't necessarily disagree. That said, there is a tremendous amount of good that this economic engine can be directed at. And I think, speaking on green energy, which is, what I know most about, I think the key is putting in the right structures to capture these externalities. So if you've got someone who's pumping tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, 20 years ago, they could do that for free because no one was stopping them. But these days, governments are putting more and more, some are using carbon taxes, some are using more complex kind of tax schemes. But suddenly that has a price. And once there's a price on it, then there's a lot of innovation that comes to bear and comes to reduce that price and make things cleaner. So I think, what we've seen is that it is a tremendous benefit. If you look at how solar energy has developed over the last 25 years, I mean, the whole green energy in general, we need that capitalism to drive it. And we need, this is one of the reasons I joined a large energy company, is because those are the firms that are going to be pushing it forward. It's going to be the major energy utilities that have to deploy this technology, that have to be on board with this. And we're seeing it happen much slower than I and a lot of people would like, but we're seeing it move in the right direction.
Yeah, you spoke a lot about capturing the economic cost of negative externalities into the business model to help address that issue. But are there any other issues that you feel like startups might be especially well positioned to help make improvements in, either socially or in the economy?
Oh, startups, I mean, across the board, startups are this tremendous engine of innovation. And like I say, the areas where I think that they can't add that much are very narrow. There's few of them. Almost everything else, I think that innovative energy is hugely beneficial. And the fact that startups are designed to be disposable in nature. They try out these new models, they experiment, they keep trying things until they find something that works, and then they scale into an enterprise and hire a bunch of MBAs to optimize everything. So, I mean, across the board, there's very few problems that startups are not actively contributing to solving.
And given how broad these areas are, I can imagine that there are quite a few people who might be thinking, oh, I see a problem in my industry or in my area of study that I wish could be better, but I don't have any business skills. I don't have any technical skills. How in the world could I even dream of starting a company to try to address this problem? Is there any advice that you would give to somebody?
Well, I mean, there's a couple ways of doing it. I mean, there's basically two fundamental approaches to that. If you don't have the business skills or technical skills required, you either find someone who does, or you learn it. You know, when I started my first startup, I had the technical skills, but I had zero sales ability. I had no idea how to run a business, but I learned. And so that's actually one of the advantages of startups founded by teams. And they tend to be, at least, I don't know how rigorous the research is, but the numbers I've seen is that startups founded by teams do tend to be more resilient. They tend to last longer. But if you have a team, you can have someone with the business experience, the sales experience. You can have someone with the deep technical knowledge or the industry connections and the industry know-how, and together can launch a really good product. If you're in a situation where you see a problem and you don't have the technical business or industry knowledge, then unless you're a student, in which case, cool, you have access to resources within your university to answer those questions. But if you're out of university, find something you understand. Find something that's you're more likely to be passionate about something you're close to. You're more likely to be passionate. You're more likely to be successful in finding a problem that you understand and care about deeply.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. Again, you're more likely to be able to actually stick to something that you care about. And enthusiasm is contagious. So you're more likely to be able to convince other people that it matters too if you actually are invested in what you want to improve. So it's a little bit more obvious what technical skills might be more important, but what does it mean to learn business skills? It seems a little bit more nebulous.
Yeah, it is rather nebulous. I think there's like kind of two buckets of those. So one is more on the execution, the sales, the business development, the understanding of your product and being able to sell it. The other is more inward facing, organizational. This is managing light touch, managing small teams, being able to do, or at least understand, corporate finance, which if you want to have investors, you're going to have your head around that. I mean, none of these things are particularly hard. They just have to be learned.
And what would you say to somebody who is a little bit hesitant about the idea of having to go build a team? Because on one hand, if you're just doing something by yourself, if you fail, it only affects you. The only person's emotion you have to deal with is your own. You really are just responsible for your own work. Whereas having to think about going out and building a team, you have to think, am I even capable of being a good manager? Can I sustain this for the long term for the benefit of the people that I'm now responsible for?
No, that's a very good question, and it's something a lot of founders ask me about taking money. And you need to be very clear about what you want. Every founder needs to be clear about what they want out of the enterprise. So, do you want to have a side business that you can run on your own and enjoy and make a little bit of money doing something you love? That's awesome. Do you want to have a small team of 10 to 20 people that you all go home at 6 o'clock every night? You have good salaries, great work-life balance. That's awesome too. But if that's what you want, neither one of those is aligned with venture capital. So, and that's fine. I think some people, you don't have to raise venture capital. There's nothing wrong with not doing so. But if you do want to build something really large, if you want to, build a multi-million-dollar business and you need venture capital, then that's a great option to go for.
Yeah. So obviously, scale is a big part of it. But are there any other kind of silent agreements that go along with taking venture capital versus kind of trying to do it on your own?
Well, I think the biggest one and the one that's kind of underappreciated is that you are signing up for a very specific execution model if you take venture capital. So when you take venture capital, you're expected to grow your company as large and as quickly as possible. And VCs have a very different attitude towards risk than, and this is more financial VCs. Corporate VCs tend to be a little different. But in general, financial VCs, they're managing a portfolio of companies. So if you work really hard and you double your business this year, they'll say, that's great. Roll the dice again, do it again, and you'll double your business again. And you might be at a point where like, no, this is good. Trying to double again next year is going to be way too risky. Let's slow down, use the capital. No. Double down, try to do it again. So you got to be sure that's what you want. And not everyone does, and not everyone should.
Yeah, so somebody who may be a little bit hesitant to focus too much on this scaling area just because for whatever reason maybe it doesn't align with their particular mission for the company. Are there any other sources of funding that they should look into?
Uh, it's hard to get external funding of that because anyone who puts money into the company is going to want to take it out again at some point with a profit. And I know a lot of people who run those kind of businesses and wouldn't take venture capital if you gave it to them because they know what they'd be in for. But I think almost all of them are bootstrapped. They grow on their own revenues. Those that have taken external funding tend to take it from like a strategic partner that they're doing business with, and that partner wants them to like build up the business to better align with theirs. So they tend to be special cases of existing relationships. But in general, if you don't want to sell the company, if you want it to run it yourself, best to plan on how to do it with your own money or with money you can borrow from the bank as you grow. And it's a very personal decision.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. Just make sure that you know what path you want to take before you start getting other people involved. Not only just you, what you want your company to become, what you want the flexibility to be for yourself going forward. All really big factors that probably really pays off to take the time to think through, even if you just want to keep going. So, just kind of stepping back a little bit to what you said about founders pretty early on in the company and people who join in the company at an early stage should expect a little bit of a lower salary just so that people have a little bit more realistic idea of what they're getting themselves into and what they can offer people who are coming on. How much of a financial difficulty can it be for people who are thinking about going down this path?
Well, it's one of those how long is a piece of string type of questions. So there's no answer to that. But I think it depends a lot on. I mean, the basic equation is the more stock someone owns, the lower their salary as a percentage of what they would get somewhere else tends to be. Most of the time, the founding team, the CEO, CFO, even if they're taking a very low salary early on, once they raise significant amounts of money, they'll bump their salary up to something reasonable. But if you're just being recruited as employee number 25, you're probably going to be compensated pretty well. I mean, pretty fairly, and you'll get a little bit of stock as well. And some companies give you the choice. They'll say, well, we can give you this much stock and a lot of stock and a little salary, or a lot of salary and a little stock. And, every negotiation is different. But as a general rule, the later you join the company, the more your salary is going to be kind of a market rate, and the less equity you'll get. The earlier you join, the more your compensation is going to be based on your equity, and the less is going to be salary.
That makes sense. So you don't have to count out joining a startup if you have a little bit of a lifestyle that you want to maintain. You can just wait until a later stage and join in then.
Yeah, exactly. And like a lot of times, so a lot of the times where we're seeing people from large enterprises getting pulled into startups, it tends to be after a Series A that the company might have raised $4 or $5 million. They're building out a sales team. And so they'll hire someone from that industry with a deep knowledge of the industry, a lot of connections, and they'll pay that person fairly.
Yeah, you have to actually compensate people if you want to attract the best talent. So that definitely makes sense. So then, kind of stealing from your podcast blatantly, but I was just wondering if there were any things that you think that the Japanese government or Japanese society as a whole should do to help promote innovation and entrepreneurship in Japan.
They're doing so much now that's great. They're really putting a spotlight on entrepreneurship. I think the one thing I would love to see Japan do is Japan needs a version of DARPA. Now, DARPA is a innovation program run by the U.S. Department of Defense. It's been around for, wow, 50, 60 years. And so much innovation has come out of that. The internet, the Ethernet, the most Wi-Fi technologies. I mean, so much has come from those research programs. A lot of the robotics has. And the unique thing about DARPA is they don't define how a problem should be solved. They just say, this is the problem we have. This is how we'll evaluate how well the problem's been solved. And then anyone can participate. And, and it can be anyone from General Electric to, two college students working in their garage, and everyone can compete on that. And I think Japan, it shouldn't be defense related. It should be focused on whatever critical problems we're facing now. But just to be able to say, okay, here are the problems. We're not dictating how they can be solved. That's the challenge. Here's the problem. Here's how we'll evaluate the solutions. Open up to everyone. And we did this a bit when I was at TEPCO. We ran a couple of innovation programs. We got a tremendous outpouring of innovation. And we ran projects with some of these innovative little companies. So it works in Japan. So I think if there was one thing I could, wave my magic wand, it would be to have the Japanese government create a version of DARPA.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense, because the impression I get with a lot of government funding here is just that it's not necessarily a bad thing, but requiring a lot of very specific documentation, very specific plans, but you don't always know exactly how you're going to solve a problem ahead of time. You kind of need to work with a team. You need to actually work through it a little bit. You don't know where you're going to end up before you even start. And are there any other things that people should be aware of when dealing with the Japanese government, especially if they are lucky enough to get some sort of funding or support from them?
Oh, wow, that's such a broad question. Nothing that really pops out at me. No, I mean it's like dealing with any bureaucracy. There's a lot of steps, a lot of paperwork. Always takes longer than you think it's going to. But I think that's kind of true everywhere.
So then, do you personally have any examples of a communication breakdown in Japan that you think was due to differences in culture specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen quite a few of them. I'll give you one that I see quite a bit of U.S. startups or foreign startups coming into Japan. That it's just a lack of understanding of Japanese business culture. So a lot of U.S. startups will come in. They'll have a series of meetings, great meetings. Everyone will be excited about the company. They'll be told how innovative they are, how they need something just like this. They might even be able to land a strategic partnership that has no particular commitments in it, and then nothing happens. So I think a lot of foreign entrants see the lack of pushback and the politeness and misjudge that as interest and excitement for their product. And so that's something I've seen over and over again.
Yeah, for sure. You have to understand a little bit more deeply about how communication itself works here before you can get a sense of what people are actually thinking about the proposal you just made them. So then, apart from that, is there any other more specific advice that you would give to people who are hoping to come to Japan for business? Any specific tools they should have in their tool belt before they get here?
I'd say it's important to signal your commitment to Japan. Like I say, things are much less transactional here, much more relationship based in Japan than they tend to be in the US or even in Europe. So make sure you're in it for the long haul, because it'll take a while to get your first customers. But that's almost mathematically identical with the longer customer retention. It's just as hard for someone to take a customer from you as it was for you to take it from someone else. So it can take a while to get the customers onboarded, but don't worry about it. You'll keep them longer.
Good. So it does pay off in the end. Don't worry.
Yes.
So thank you for being so generous with your time and your wisdom today. And is there anything that you wish you had gotten the chance to talk a little bit more about, or that you wish I'd asked you?
Can we plug the podcast?
Yeah, of course. I was going to do that whether you did or not. So
all right. Yeah. So please take a listen to Disrupting Japan. It's at disruptingjapan.com.
Yeah. And I found it on Apple Podcasts, but I assume it's on all the platforms.
It's all over the place. Yeah. In your preferred podcast platform.
Yes, only the finest podcasting platforms. So I will be sure to link everything in the description of this episode. And if there's nothing else to add, thanks again, and I hope that you have a great night.
Oh, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
I hope that you enjoyed today's conversation. Be sure to check out the links in the description of the episode to learn more about Tim and subscribe to his podcast so that you can be in the know when it comes to the startup ecosystem in Japan. If you enjoyed today's episode, go ahead and share it with a friend, colleague, or connection on LinkedIn to help spread the perspectives and information shared in the podcast. Also, remember to go ahead and subscribe or follow on whatever platform you're using, and also leave a rating and review if you enjoy the podcast. If you'd like to support the podcast, there are a few things that you can do. You can support the podcast using the listener support button on Spotify for podcasters, or contribute to my Ko-fi page. You can find the link to do so in the description of this episode. I'd love to hear from you directly, so if you'd like to leave a voice message, you can find the link to do that in the description as well. But for now, remember that the more you learn, the more confident you will become as you explore all of the opportunities Japan has to offer you. Until next time, mata kondo.